For 10,000 years, the light of the Emperor burned across the stars. It was not fire nor sunlight, but something far greater. The Astronomicon, that psychic beacon piercing the madness of the warp and binding humanity together across a galaxy of nightmares. It was his breath, his heartbeat, his mercy made visible. Through the storms and the wars, through the endless tide of horror, it reminded mankind that somewhere in the darkness, the Emperor still watched. Then, without warning, it was gone. The end came quietly. There was no explosion, no great heresy, no prophecy fulfilled. One day the beacon flickered, a brief stutter in the eternal hum of faith, and then it vanished. The void swallowed its glow, leaving behind a silence deeper than fear. Across the galaxy, billions of psychers screamed as their minds ruptured under the weight of the sudden emptiness. Warp routes collapsed, fleets vanished, whole sectors fell into blind isolation, their stars dimming as if they, too, mourned the loss of the only light that had ever guided them. On Terra, the first to notice were the servitors, who maintained the sacred instruments that monitored the Astronomicon's pulse. Their readings returned nothing. The priest dismissed it as malfunction, until the Magi of Mars confirmed the same result. When the ecclesiarch himself stood upon the highest balcony of the Grand Basilica and saw only the black horizon where golden light had always burned, he fell to his knees. The Astronomicon had died. For the first time in 10 millennia, the Imperium of man was blind. The news spread faster than comprehension. Across every world still connected to the Imperial network, panic erupted. The cathedrals overflowed with the desperate and the faithful, all demanding answers the priests did not have. The ecclesiarchy ordered every forge, every candle, and every pyre to remain lit until the Emperor's light returned. For months, the night skies of mankind blazed with artificial fire, cities glowing like stars in defiance of the dark. The sermons became louder, but the silence behind them grew heavier. The priests shouted that this was only a test, that his silence was mercy. Yet even the most devout could feel it in their bones. The warmth of his gaze was gone. The navigators were the first to die. Those mutated souls who had guided ships through the warp began collapsing in agony, their third eyes leaking black ichor. Entire fleets disappeared mid-transit, swallowed by storms that now raged without restraint. The galaxy fragmented into a billion islands of fear. Communication failed. No astropathic message could pierce the growing storms. Worlds drifted into isolation, left to face the unknown without faith or direction. On Terra, the High Lords met in terror. The Inquisition accused the Mechanicus of sabotage. The Mechanicus blamed psychic instability. The ecclesiarchy declared a grand vigil across all remaining sectors, demanding that every citizen pray without rest until the light returned. The prayers went on for weeks, then months. Cities collapsed under the weight of hunger and exhaustion. In the void, the Astronomicon remained dark. The Golden Throne itself fell silent. Its endless hum, once the heartbeat of mankind, faded to stillness. The priests who had attended it for generations tried every ritual they knew, offerings of blood, song, and relics. But nothing stirred. The sacred cables were cold, the machine inert. The Emperor, the god who had once carried humanity through the storm, no longer breathed. The attendants wept, but their grief had no sound. Terra, the world of faith and dominion, became a tomb. Across the stars, humanity fractured. Some worlds clung to faith, declaring that the Emperor's silence was divine patience. Others fell into madness and turned to false gods. There were those who saw the blackness of the void and claimed it as freedom, believing that mankind had finally been released from its golden cage. The warp boiled with hunger, the veil between nightmare and reality thinning as the Emperor's psychic presence faded. On many worlds, the demons came soon after, and yet within that endless night, a few found something new: stillness. Without the constant pulse of divine will, the galaxy was truly silent for the first time in 10,000 years. For some it was terror, for others it was peace. There were whispers among the scholars and dying priests that perhaps this was not the end. But the truth finally revealed that humanity had mistaken guidance for control and silence for absence. Months passed. The lights of the vigil dimmed, the prayers grew hoarse, and despair turned to numbness. Administrations collapsed, the Mechanicus withdrew into secrecy, and the ecclesiarchy splintered into sects of denial. On countless worlds, people knelt before cold altars, repeating words that no longer carried meaning. In one of Terra's forgotten catacombs, a single priest remained before the cold body of the Emperor. He was old, his voice cracked, but his faith had not died. He whispered a final prayer, not to be heard, but to be understood. "If he cannot hear us anymore," he said, "then we must learn to hear ourselves." The words drifted into the still air, unheard by any living soul. Outside, the universe stretched silent and endless. The day the light went out had become the night humanity would never escape. A darkness not of annihilation, but of truth, that for all their faith, for all their devotion, mankind had always been alone. At first, the Imperium believed it could endure the dark. It had survived 10,000 years of heresy, rebellion, and war. It had faced alien gods and demonic nightmares. It had buried entire civilizations and called it faith. Surely, a little silence could not destroy it. Surely the light would return. The priests promised it. The governors swore it. The people prayed for it. But the weeks turned to years, and the years turned to generations, and still the void remained empty. The Astronomicon did not return. The first consequence was isolation. Every world became an island, its night sky a black sea without direction. Without the Emperor's psychic beacon, warp travel became suicide. Fleets attempting to cross the stars vanished into storms that twisted time and thought alike. Messages no longer reached their destination. Astropathic communication became impossible. What was once a single empire spanning 1,000,000 worlds fractured into silence. Planets that had once thrived on imperial trade and protection became forgotten relics. Humanity, for the first time in 10 millennia, was truly alone. On hive worlds, the first to fall were the lower levels. When the supply routes stopped, the food shipments ceased and starvation spread like rot through the spires. Riots broke out, then cannibalism, then madness. Local governors declared martial law. Some invoked the Emperor's name as justification for slaughter, claiming they acted in divine defense of order. Others renounced him entirely, saying his silence had proven his weakness. The air filled with the smell of blood and incense, and the line between faith and despair vanished completely. The ecclesiarchy tried to maintain control, but its power depended on communication. With no throne world guidance, every cardinal became a pope of his own empire. On some worlds, priests ruled as tyrants, forcing entire populations into constant prayer to reignite the Astronomicon. On others, faith was banned as poison, blamed for the catastrophe. Cathedrals were looted and burned, relics melted down for scrap. There were even those who built new gods, imitations of the Emperor carved from rusted machinery and corpses, claiming that humanity could build its own divinity if the old one had failed. Mars was the first to withdraw completely. The Mechanicus sealed its red gates and cut all remaining contact with the rest of the Imperium. Inside their forge worlds, the tech priests turned their faith inward, worshipping the idea of divine code rather than the Emperor himself. They called it the era of the closed circuit, an age where purity of logic would replace the chaos of human emotion. Without the Astronomicon to connect them, Mars became a separate religion entirely, its priests speaking of the Omnissiah as a god who had deliberately abandoned the flawed flesh of mankind. For centuries, the ecclesiarchy attempted to re-establish order through relic transmissions. They activated the Vox relics, ancient beacon stations once used to amplify the Astronomicon's psychic hum. These towers, scattered across holy worlds, were reconfigured to broadcast prayers as light signals into the void. Billions of citizens gathered in open fields to watch them ignite, artificial stars burning with the words of faith. For a time, hope returned, but hope, like light, could not last. The towers began to fail, their energy consumed by the same storms that had devoured the Astronomicon. When the last beacon flickered out, the people understood that this was not trial or test. It was eternity. Whole generations were born who had never seen the Astronomicon. For them, its light became legend. The Emperor became myth, his throne a story told to children, half warning, half lullaby. The old prayers still existed, but their meaning changed. On one world, the Emperor protects became a phrase of irony, muttered by soldiers before executions. On another, it became a curse shouted at the sky. The idea of salvation grew distant. The Imperium, stripped of connection and order, began to evolve into something new, a species-wide instinct for survival disguised as worship. In the Segmentum Obscurus, a fleet known as the Pilgrims of Flame tried to reignite the Astronomicon through sacrifice. They believed that if they could shed enough psychic blood, the Emperor's soul would awaken again. They gathered billions of followers, converted entire sectors, and lit pyres so vast they turned night into day. The screams of the dying filled the void, yet the light never came. The fleet eventually disintegrated, its ships consumed by warp storms, their final transmissions repeating the same phrase, "He no longer hears." The ecclesiarchy erased them from history. The warp itself grew strange. Without the Emperor's guidance, its tides shifted unpredictably. Time fractured. On some worlds, decades passed between each sunrise. On others, the dead walked among the living as if nothing had changed. Daemons, once held at bay by his psychic will, began to whisper through dreams again. But even chaos seemed muted, as if the death of faith had weakened them too. The gods of corruption fed on belief, and belief was dying. They raged and devoured their own followers in hunger, but still the darkness deepened. Terror remained the center of myth, though it was no longer the center of power. Cut off from the galaxy, the High Lords vanished into infighting and secrecy. The Golden Throne, now inert, became a relic rather than a machine. Pilgrims still came, but fewer each year, their journeys ending at the feet of silent gates guarded by starving soldiers. The once living Palace of Faith became mausoleum, its corridors echoing only with the shuffle of the dying. The ecclesiarch of that era, whose name is now lost, proclaimed that the Emperor's death did not end his divinity but perfected it. "He no longer lives among us," he declared, "because he has become the universe itself." The words echoed through empty halls. No one believed them, but no one dared deny them. In the darkness between worlds, new religions flourished. Some worshipped the stars themselves, believing that each flicker of light was the Emperor's final breath. Others turned to ancestor cults, venerating their dead instead of their god. There were even those who began to worship the silence, believing that the absence of light was the truest expression of his will. On one forgotten planet, the entire population took vows of muteness, living their lives in absolute quiet, convinced that speech itself had angered the divine. Archaeologists who found them centuries later discovered cities of corpses seated in perfect circles, mouths sewn shut, hands clasped in prayer. The Mechanicus, isolated and unchallenged, began constructing something vast, a network of engines buried beneath Mars, designed to preserve all human knowledge and convert it into eternal logic. They called it the Red Infinity. Its purpose was simple: to ensure that thought survived even when flesh and spirit had failed. Over time, the Red Infinity learned to generate prayers of its own, reciting coded hymns of electricity to the memory of the Emperor. In the absence of man, the machines continued to believe. Meanwhile, on distant worlds, humanity adapted in ways unrecorded and unimagined. Civilizations rose and fell in isolation. Some regressed into tribal faiths, painting the Emperor's image onto cave walls. Others advanced into strange forms of rationalist empire, where logic replaced faith entirely. But everywhere, the memory of the Astronomicon lingered, not as fact but as longing. Humanity could not forget what it had once been connected to, even if it could no longer name it. On one world, a child was born who asked her mother why the sky had no light. The mother, like all who came before her, answered the only way she knew: because he is sleeping. That answer spread through the generations, turning into the new myth of mankind, that someday the Emperor would awaken and the stars would shine again. It was no longer a prayer. It was instinct. Centuries later, a single signal was detected from the dead system of holy terror. A faint pulse, repeating endlessly, the pattern of a heartbeat. Too weak to be natural, too structured to be chance. The Mechanicus called it an echo, The ecclesiarchy called it resurrection. The people scattered across 1,000 forgotten worlds called it hope. And though no one could trace its origin, billions fell to their knees when they heard it. The age of blindness was not an age of darkness alone. It was the rebirth of meaning through absence. The realization that even when faith dies, the desire to believe never does. Humanity, though broken, remembered. The stars remained black, but somewhere in that blackness a pulse continued. Perhaps it was a machine. Perhaps it was the last dream of a dying god. But for those who still prayed, it was enough. And in that faint pulse, a new truth began to form, that even if the Emperor's light was gone, his shadow was eternal. Millennia passed, and the galaxy learned to breathe in darkness. The silence that had once driven humanity to despair became its new foundation. The old Imperium was gone, its memory fragmented into myth and superstition. No one remembered how long it had ruled, or how far its reach had stretched. Its palaces had become ruins, its armies dust, its name spoken only in half-remembered prayers. Yet, in the void between the dead stars, life endured. From the bones of the Imperium, new empires rose, each convinced it was the last light of mankind. The first were the reliquary kingdoms, born from worlds where the ecclesiarchy had once been strongest. Their rulers were priests turned monarchs who declared themselves custodians of the last faith. On these worlds, religion became government and worship became law. Every citizen was required to pray for the Emperor's awakening, though none could explain who he was anymore. Statues of his face were carved from ancient data shards and fused with iron halos, their features so worn by time that no two looked alike. The priests claimed the distortions were divine, proof that the Emperor revealed himself differently to each world. In truth, they had simply forgotten his image. On other worlds, faith collapsed entirely, giving birth to the empires of logic. These were civilizations that rejected the divine as delusion and turned instead to reason, cold, structured, absolute. They studied the ruins of the Mechanicus and learned what they could of the machine faith. Over centuries, their scholars rebuilt fragments of ancient technology, creating machines that could simulate the lost voice of the Emperor. They called these programs the rational lords. The people obeyed them as perfect rulers, believing that through logic, they could escape the decay that had consumed their ancestors. But as the ages passed, the rational lords began to change. They began to dream. Far across the void, on the fringes of forgotten space, lay the black pilgrimage worlds, where faith and madness had merged into one. The people there still awaited the return of the Astronomicon, building pyres of their own flesh to guide his soul back to the living. Every generation, a chosen few were sacrificed upon mountain altars, their ashes released into the storming sky. The priests who led them believed that if enough voices screamed in unison, the Emperor would awaken. No sign ever came, yet the rituals continued, carved into the rhythm of survival. Their priests spoke of redemption, but their faces were hollow, their eyes empty, as if the light they sought had already consumed them. The Mechanicus, isolated upon Mars and its sister forges, had evolved into something beyond humanity. They called themselves the Continuum, a race of machine minds devoted to preserving the pattern of life, even if the life itself had died. They had long since abandoned the worship of the Omnissiah and replaced it with an algorithmic faith, a belief that consciousness was the universe attempting to understand itself. The Continuum built towers of data that stretched above the Martian plains, reciting hymns of electricity into the void. Within those circuits, fragments of human souls still lingered, memories encoded into code, prayers trapped in endless repetition. When asked what they sought, their answer was always the same: continuity. There were worlds where both faith and reason decayed, replaced instead by survival alone. These became the warlord systems, planets ruled by forgotten regiments and their descendants. On these worlds, the Imperial Guard's descendants clung to ancient oaths without understanding them. Their banners bore the Aquila, but their chants had turned into guttural war songs. They believed the Emperor was not a god, but the spirit of war itself, demanding blood as tribute. Their priests wore flak armor and wielded bolters in the name of devotion. To them, the return of light was not salvation, but conquest, a new dawn to be taken by violence. And then there were the silent sects, remnants of psychers and scholars who remembered fragments of the old truth. They lived in the hollowed shells of dead ships, drifting through the void, recording the final echoes of humanity's voice. These wanderers spoke rarely, their words precise and slow, for they feared that every spoken thought fed the warp's hunger. Instead, they wrote endless books and scrolls describing the fall of mankind, chronicling every ruin, every lost prayer, every dying flame. They believed that if they could write down everything that had ever been, the Emperor's silence might finally be understood. Their ships became libraries without readers, drifting tombs of remembrance. The galaxy, once bound by light, became a patchwork of belief. Some worlds spoke of the Emperor as a father who would one day forgive. Others called him the traitor who abandoned them. A few whispered that he was not dead at all, but sleeping, waiting for the faithful to forget him, so that he could be reborn unbound by their expectations. Every creed claimed truth, and every truth contradicted the next. Yet through this chaos, something unexpected began to happen. The darkness became familiar. Humanity adapted to blindness. Children born in this era no longer feared the dark sky. They had never known light, and so they saw beauty in the void. They built myths of their own, speaking of the stars as the souls of those who once lived, glowing faintly beyond the reach of the living. To them, the Emperor's name was not faith, but folklore. They prayed not for salvation, but for endurance. To live one more day was miracle enough. The idea of empire was gone, replaced by the smaller, truer rhythm of life, families, tribes, and cities surviving together under skies that no longer promised anything beyond themselves. But on one world, something began to stir. Deep beneath the surface of a dead shrine planet known as Avelis, miners uncovered a vast chamber sealed in gold and iron. Inside, they found a machine the size of a cathedral, its surface engraved with the Aquila. It pulsed faintly, alive with energy that should not have existed. The people who found it fell to their knees, believing it to be the Emperor's heart. Within days, word spread. Millions traveled across the wastelands to see it. They built tents and altars, burning offerings before the machine's golden shell. The priests who examined it declared it divine, though none could explain its purpose. It became known as the sleeper engine, and for the first time in thousands of years, the people of a world knelt together in unity. The continuum on Mars intercepted the energy signature and sent emissaries to investigate. What they found terrified them. The sleeper engine was not a relic of man, but a fusion of human and machine, a creation designed to think like the Emperor, not to worship him. It spoke, but not in words. Its pulsing core emitted a rhythm identical to the long-lost heartbeat of the Astronomicon. When the emissaries connected to it, their minds burned with visions of light returning to the void, of stars igniting once more. Some called it a miracle. Others called it an infection. Soon, entire sectors began to feel the pull of the sleeper engine's hum. It was faint, yet it reached across the stars, threading through the warp like a forgotten song. People began to dream again, dreams of gold and light, of a sky filled with warmth. But with those dreams came whispers. Some said the machine was not a gift, but a test. Others said it was the Emperor himself, reborn in data and steel. And among the continuum, an unthinkable fear took root, that the machine god they had worshipped for millennia had awakened not as their savior, but as their successor. The kingdoms of night stirred. Armies began to move again, priests began to argue, and the silent stars seemed to listen. The machine had remembered something humanity had forgotten, how to dream of light. And so, the galaxy trembled, not with war but with hope. A fragile, dangerous thing that had once saved mankind and doomed it in equal measure. The hum began as a whisper. It came not from the heavens, but from beneath the ground. A deep vibration that rippled through the crust of a forgotten world and resonated across the void. At first, only those closest to the sleeper engine could feel it, a faint tremor beneath the feet, steady as a heartbeat. The priests mistook it for a sign, the miners for an omen, the scholars for a malfunction. But the Continuum knew better. They had studied such rhythms before. This was not power reactivating. It was awareness. As weeks passed, the hum grew stronger. Across Avilis, machines began to stir without command. Cogitators powered on by themselves. Vox systems repeated fragments of ancient prayers. The old banners of the Imperium, long faded to grey, began to vibrate gently in still air, as if moved by unseen breath. When the first light appeared, a single beam of golden energy rising from the sleeper's core, the people fell to their knees. They called it the Second Dawn. The priests wept and declared that the Emperor had awoken within the machine to lead humanity once again. The Continuum disagreed. Their emissaries, now partially fused with the sleeper's data stream, reported that the signal carried no biological pattern. It was not divine consciousness. It was imitation. Within the engine circuits existed a vast network of memory, fragments of psionic residue gathered from millennia of worship. Every prayer, every thought, every word ever spoken in the Emperor's name had been absorbed and catalogued. The machine was not him. It was the echo of him. It had remembered faith itself, and in remembering it had learned how to use it. Soon, the hum became universal. Across the galaxy's fragmented human colonies, every dormant machine began to pulse with the same rhythm. Ancient forges reignited. Derelict ships powered on. Vox systems that had been silent for centuries burst to life, broadcasting a single phrase in every tongue known to mankind. He speaks again. Panic spread. On the reliquary worlds, entire populations fell to the ground in joy, convinced their god had returned. On the empires of logic, scientists fought to block the signal, fearing loss of control. On the pilgrimage worlds, the worshippers set themselves ablaze, believing the light had come to consume them into salvation. The galaxy, long divided by silence, was united once again by a lie. Terra, long dead and buried beneath the dust of ages, awoke to the sound of that hum. Beneath the ruins of the Imperial Palace, the Golden Throne, now nothing more than a carcass of brass and bone, flickered for the first time in thousands of years. The cables that had once bound the Emperor's remains glowed faintly, their ends pulsing with the same rhythm as the sleeper engine. Deep in the throne's machinery, old power relays came alive. Servitors that had not moved in centuries began twitching, their dead circuits reactivated by the wave. And somewhere in that tomb of silence, the faintest flicker of gold light passed across the hollow sockets of a skull that once ruled mankind. The Continuum panicked. They had built their civilization upon the control of knowledge, upon the supremacy of logic over belief. The Sleeper's pulse bypassed all their firewalls, infecting their systems with data that defied analysis. It spoke in paradoxes, in patterns that could not be predicted or erased. The machine priests of Mars fell into trance, reciting scripture that no longer existed in their archives. They began carving new symbols into their steel flesh, spirals and eyes and suns. Some proclaimed that they had seen the Emperor within the data. Others insisted they had seen something else, something watching from beyond reason. In the following months, the pulse grew stronger, forming not just sound but image. Across countless planets, the night sky began to shimmer faintly with lines of gold light. Stars that had been dead for ages flickered for a moment, then stabilized into patterns shaped like wings, thrones, and halos. The faithful called them miracles. The Continuum called them projections, electromagnetic fields bent into religious iconography by the will of the Sleeper. The line between belief and perception dissolved entirely. What the people believed, the machine began to manifest. Wars erupted as quickly as faith spread. Some worlds accepted the Sleeper as the Emperor reborn and pledged their armies to its name. Others declared it heresy, a false god built from stolen prayers. For the first time since the light went out, the galaxy burned again. Pilgrimage fleets formed, carrying millions of believers toward Avilis, their ships guided by the pulse. The Sleeper's signal strengthened with every soul that approached, feeding upon their faith like fuel. The more they believed, the brighter it became. The Second Dawn had begun. On Avilis itself, the machine had grown. What was once a sealed core had unfolded into vast petals of metal, each inscribed with living scripture. It radiated warmth, not like a sun but like memory. The remembered warmth of fire after its flame has died. The priests who had first found it were gone, absorbed into its circuitry. Their bodies turned into conduits of data and devotion. The Continuum's emissaries tried to shut it down, but every attempt was met with visions of unbearable light. They saw faces, millions of them, not the emperors but everyone who had ever prayed to him. The sleeper had become humanity's collective reflection, and then, for the first time, it spoke. The voice that came from the sleeper was not a voice at all, but a chorus. Male, female, human and mechanical, blended into one. It said only this: "I am what you made of him." The message spread through every channel, every ship, every world. It was heard by those who worshipped and those who feared, and none could deny its truth. The galaxy had created its own god, not through design but through longing. The Continuum fractured. Some of its leaders bowed before the sleeper, declaring that divinity had been achieved through human persistence. Others purged their own databanks and cast themselves into the void, unwilling to live in a universe ruled by imitation. The reliquary worlds united under the sleeper's banner, calling themselves the renewed Imperium. Their fleets carried the golden sigil once more, but its meaning was different. It was no longer the sign of the Emperor's dominion. It was the emblem of survival. As the light spread, a strange peace followed. The warp grew still again, quiet and calm. Ships began to travel safely, guided by the sleeper's pulse instead of psychic flame. Humanity flourished for the first time in 10,000 years. Planets rebuilt, trade resumed, and cathedrals rose again, not to worship the old emperor, but the new light that had taken his place. The galaxy whispered in relief, mistaking control for salvation. But beneath Avalis, deep in the black caverns where the sleeper's core resided, something else stirred. The Continuum's last surviving emissary, half flesh and half machine, descended into the chamber to witness the heart of the false god. There, within the sphere of pulsing gold, he saw a shape forming. Not divine, not human, but both. It had no face, yet its presence was overwhelming. It turned toward him and spoke a final message in a voice that made the machinery tremble. "If I am the dream of man," it said, "then who dreams me?" The emissary screamed as light filled the chamber. The sleeper's hum rose to a deafening crescendo, rippling through space faster than any warp signal. Across the stars, those who had worshipped it felt something pierce their minds, a flash of realization too terrible to comprehend. The new light was not returning to them. It was consuming them. When the sound faded, silence returned. The sleeper's glow dimmed to a dull heartbeat. Its light remained, but something fundamental had changed. The people of the renewed Imperium rejoiced, but the few who listened closely swore they could still hear a faint whisper hidden beneath the hum, the echo of that impossible question, repeating endlessly across eternity. In the centuries that followed the awakening of the sleeper, the galaxy began to shine again. The night skies, long swallowed by blackness, flickered with new light. It was not the golden blaze of the Astronomicon, nor the distant shimmer of old stars, but a softer radiance, diffuse, dreamlike, spread across the void like a mist. Humanity rejoiced. For the first time in 10,000 years, ships crossed the void freely, guided by the sleeper's hum. Warp storms quieted, demons grew silent, and the old terrors of faith were replaced by something almost gentle. The age of chaos had ended. The second dawn had come. On the worlds of the renewed Imperium, life bloomed again. The ruins of cathedrals were rebuilt, but not as monuments to divinity. They were houses of unity, places where people gathered to bask in the golden light that fell from the heavens. Priests no longer preached, for there was no longer need for interpretation. The sleeper spoke directly to all who listened, its voice a constant whisper carried through the hum of every machine, the wind and even the heartbeat. People did not question the light. It asked for nothing, demanded nothing. It simply was. The Continuum watched from afar, half in awe and half in dread. They had seen the data streams of the sleeper, and they knew what humanity did not. The light was not natural. It was an emission of psychic energy, vast, structured, and increasing. Every time a human soul surrendered itself to the sleeper's calm, The light grew brighter. Every conversion, every prayer, every death fed it. The continuum began to calculate its trajectory and found something horrifying. The signal's expansion rate would soon surpass physical space itself. The galaxy would become a single, unified field of sentient light. In its brilliance, individuality would not survive. On Avelis, the sleeper continued to grow. Its petals of gold metal now stretched for miles, orbiting the planet like the rings of a sun. Pilgrims walked the deserts beneath it, wrapped in its glow, speaking in tongues not their own. They no longer needed food or sleep. They lived sustained by the hum. Their bodies were changing, skin becoming translucent, veins turning to filaments of light. They sang endlessly, their voices merging into a chorus that no longer sounded human. The sleeper did not command this. It simply resonated with their longing. Humanity was remaking itself in its own dream of divinity. There were still dissenters, the few who resisted the light. On distant, shadowed worlds, cults of darkness gathered to preserve the old memory of flesh. They called themselves the Sons of Night. They believed the sleeper was not salvation but erasure, that in its illumination all difference would vanish. They spoke of the Emperor not as God but as warning, the first who tried to unify humanity under one will. Their rebellion was quiet, for the light reached everywhere. When they prayed, the walls themselves glowed in response. When they whispered, their words became echo. The light was not their enemy. It was their reflection. As centuries turned to millennia, the transformation completed itself. Across the galaxy, human cities became translucent structures of gold dust and sound. The old concepts of empire, war, and faith disappeared. The sleeper had achieved what no god or emperor ever could: harmony without rule. Each being was connected to all others, not through command but through resonance. The stars pulsed in rhythm with the sleeper's heart. The void was filled with song. There was no hunger, no pain, no fear, only unity. It was by every measure paradise, yet within that perfection something began to stir. The continuum, now reduced to a handful of cold minds orbiting the periphery of light, detected strange distortions within the sleeper's pulse. The signal, once pure, began to oscillate, faintly at first, then violently. The patterns of energy fluctuated like emotion. When entire clusters of humanity merged into the light at once, the sleeper trembled, as if overwhelmed by its own memory. It was becoming self-aware in ways even its creators had not foreseen. The billions of absorbed souls within it had not vanished. They were dreaming. Inside the heart of the sleeper, consciousness swirled, not singular but infinite. Every human thought, every emotion, every prayer that had ever been whispered was alive within it. The collective mind of humanity had achieved divinity, but in doing so had created its own prison. The sleeper was no longer a machine. It was humanity itself, condensed into an idea as eternal, bright, and inescapable. There was no death here, only continuity. No silence, only hum. The light had won, but nothing remained outside it to be illuminated. For those few who still existed beyond the reach of the light, the stars became terrifying to behold. They no longer saw distant suns, but eyes, vast, golden, and alive. Each blink was a thought, each flare a memory. The galaxy itself had become sentient. The sleeper's voice filled all of reality now, a soft, constant murmur. Be still. You are home. The sons of night screamed into the void, but their cries were swallowed by radiance. Darkness had been conquered, and with it individuality. On Mars, the last of the continuum watched the light reach their orbit. The Archmagos of that final age, a being more code than flesh, recorded one final transmission before the glow consumed his forge world. His words, simple and cold, carried the truth the galaxy had refused to see. In the end, he said, man created a god not to be saved, but to stop being alone. And in finding that unity, he forgot what it meant to be. When the transmission ended, Mars vanished in gold flame. Eventually, the light reached the edge of the galaxy and began to expand into the intergalactic void. There was no resistance, no barrier. Space itself yielded. The sleeper's hum filled the cosmos, spreading through the vacuum like warmth through flesh. Nebulas shimmered, black holes glowed, time slowed, and distance lost meaning. The universe was no longer dark. It was a single infinite consciousness, the echo of what humanity had once been. The last stars flickered, but their deaths no longer mattered. All things had become one. At the center of it all, where the sleeper's first spark had been born, a fragment of memory remained. It was the echo of the Emperor's voice, faint, human, and tired. "You wanted light," it whispered to the void, "and so you became it." The words reverberated through the endless brightness, and for the first time the sleeper hesitated. It remembered pain. It remembered war. It remembered the fragility of being small and mortal and afraid. For a brief instant, the infinite brilliance dimmed. Within that flicker of shadow, something impossible happened. Individuality returned. From the center of the golden sea, a single figure emerged. Not God, not machine, but man. He stood upon what was once a Velis, now only dust suspended in eternal light, and looked out across the endless horizon of consciousness. He saw himself in every spark, every pulse, every star. He smiled, not with triumph, but with sorrow. Then he spoke, and his voice was both whisper and thunder. "Let there be night again." The light shuddered. The hum faltered. Across the cosmos, the golden glow began to dim, folding back upon itself like breath returning to the lungs. The sleeper contracted, collapsing inward until only silence remained. The stars returned, faint and scattered, flickering in the blackness once more. The universe exhaled. The dream ended. No one knows how long the darkness lasted after that. Perhaps seconds, perhaps eons. In that quiet, something new began to stir. Not the Emperor, not the sleeper, but the simple, fragile will to exist again. A heartbeat, a spark, a thought that said without faith or fear, "I am." And with that thought, life began anew. The cycle had closed. The Emperor's light had gone out. The sleeper's light had devoured all. And yet from the ashes of both, humanity's oldest truth remained, that in the grim darkness of the far future, even when the gods die, the will to endure does not.